curious, how many of you guys would consider yourself a skeptic? Raise your hand if you tend to be a skeptical person. Okay. Now here's my guess, okay? Here's my guess. Some of you guys are so skeptical that when I said raise your hand if you're a skeptic, you were like, I'm not sure about this. What is this for? Like, I need more info, right? And so just so you know, when I'm in an audience and someone else is speaking, I hate it when they ask people to raise their hands, and I never do. So if I were sitting there among you, I would not have raised my hand. Because I'm somebody who likes to know, like, everything before I do anything. And it drives Jen a little bit crazy, because we can't just do stuff. I got to, like, know everything about it. I'm somebody who's very, very slow to get on board with anything. I have a lot of questions. I want a ton of information. And in my head, there's this endless series of yeah buts. And I know some of you are this way. And that has made faith, okay, walking with Jesus, a particularly hard thing for you, a struggle for you. And maybe you're somebody who's thought something like this. You've thought, you know what? If God would just do something spectacular one time that I could see, then maybe I'd have bigger faith, right? I just need something spectacular. And I think this is such a common thought. And it's a thought that I've had many times, especially in my early years of being a Christian. We want God to do something spectacular, like to prove to us that he exists. But I wonder when we think that, I wonder if God thinks back, he's like, okay, like what? Right? Like what? Like, what do you want me to do? And that's a great question, I think. Like, what do you want God to do, really? What do you want God to do? Well, what would God need to do to remove all of your doubts? We're in this series called The Seven Signs, and we're walking with the disciple John as he walked with Jesus. We're working our way through the Gospel of John, this first century document written by the disciple John. And before we jump into today's story, I'd like to pause and revisit a tension that John addresses throughout his Gospel. That possibly the two most misunderstood and misused words when it comes to all of religion, and especially Christianity, are these two words. Okay, faith and believe. Faith and believe. And we've talked about this over the last few weeks. For some reason, these words take on a different meaning, a special meaning, when we drop them into a religious context. Here's what I mean. In every other context outside of religion, okay, we believe stuff based on evidence, right? We believe stuff based on evidence. We believe because of what we see or what we hear or maybe something that we read. And here's something else that really influences what we believe. We believe when we trust the person giving us the information. Right? If we think the person giving the information knows what they're talking about, they're knowledgeable, when we think that the people that are telling us these things are unbiased, we think that they know what they're talking about, then we're much more likely to believe what they say. So we believe all kinds of things, all of us do, we believe all kinds of things that we've never actually seen. We believe those things because trustworthy people tell us that it's how it is. One example for me. One vacation destination that I have on my bucket list is Australia. So how many of you would like to go to Australia? How many of you aren't raising your hand because you're afraid I'm going to point something out? Australia, are you kidding me? I'm not crazy about the plane, that long flight down there. But my gosh, this white sandy beaches. Right, the laid-back culture, the amazing accents. Good day, mate. Throw another shrimp on the barbie. So good. They would think I was a local. And you guys, someday I want to go. And here's the thing, I believe Australia is a real place. I believe it exists. I believe that it is beautiful. I believe people get eaten by sharks sometimes there. But I have never been there. I've never been there. I've never seen it for myself. But I believe because lots and lots and lots of people say that it's real, and I happen to find those people credible. As far as I can tell, they have no reason to make this up. And the truth is, much of what I believe and much of what you believe, I've never seen myself, and you've never seen yourself. I mean, anything that I believe about history, so much of what I believe about science, most of my worldview is shaped by people telling me how it is. And if I trust the person or the people that are giving me the info, then I'm likely to believe what they're telling me, even if I haven't seen it firsthand. Okay, but that kind of faith is still based on evidence, right? It's still based on some kind of evidence. I'm still believing because of evidence. Now, as we've walked through this series, here's something that we've seen. No one in the first century followed Jesus because of faith. No one in the first century followed Jesus because of faith. In our day, people sometimes say stuff like this about Christian faith, right? They say like, well, you just have to believe, brother. Right? You just got to take it by faith, sister. But in the first century, while Jesus was alive and doing what he did, this is not at all what people did. In the first century, they followed because of what they saw and what they heard. The crowds, the disciples, they followed because of evidence. They didn't just take it by faith, man. They followed because of what they saw and what they heard. But here's what we're going to see today, and this is where it gets really interesting. Not everyone who saw and heard believed. Well, that's weird. But not everyone who saw and heard believed. According to John, among those watching Jesus do what he did, some believed and some didn't. John describes Jesus doing these spectacular things that were undeniable, and for some it produced faith and belief. But for others, even the spectacular was not enough. And today, I want us to consider why both of those things were possible. Many of you are aware of something called confirmation bias. Right? We talked about this a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of this series. Confirmation bias. We all give more weight to information that confirms what we already believe or what we want to believe. We all do this to some degree. Okay, I do this, you do this, we all do this. It's human nature. But if you take confirmation bias to another level, and when you, like, if you do that, it amplifies up to something that we could call willful blindness. Okay, willful blindness is when you refuse to believe something, even when there's overwhelming evidence for it. It's like confirmation bias on steroids, right? It's deciding, okay, I'm not going to believe something no matter how much evidence there may be. Why? Because I don't want to believe it. Because it challenges what I already believe. And in today's story, we will encounter both confirmation bias and willful blindness. And this story is one of the most fascinating to me in the Gospel of John. I love it. And so it's John chapter 9. Here we go. It starts this way. It says, as he went along, that would be Jesus, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And the assumption in the first century was a cause and effect relationship. Sin caused suffering. Suffering was a result of sin. So if somebody was suffering, it was because they sinned. And in a sense, the suffering are simply getting what they deserve, according to that worldview, right? So as you can imagine, that thinking affected compassion levels in an entire culture. So the disciples see this man, and it raises a challenging question, because this particular man was born blind. He was born blind. So how does that work? Like, who sinned? So they asked Jesus, hey, Jesus, what happened here? Did this man, like, sin in the womb, or did his parents sin? And it doesn't really say. I'm hoping that maybe they were whispering that question to Jesus as they were standing near this man. But we know that sometimes our behavior does result in suffering, right? And sometimes we suffer because of other people's behavior, right? But when those things are the case, it's usually pretty obvious. And so when it's not obvious, as Jesus is about to point out, then we shouldn't assume any kind of relationship between the two. And here, Jesus responds by challenging their entire paradigm. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Okay, this is not a result of anyone's personal sin, Jesus says, but even in this man's pain, God is up to something. In other words, okay, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, God chooses to display his power on the platform or the stage of our pain, okay, or our suffering. In fact, you've seen that before, I bet. You've seen somebody going through pain and suffering, and their response to what they were going through was extraordinary. And it caused your faith to get bigger. Caused their faith to get bigger. It caused your faith to get bigger. Well, here's what I've noticed about my own faith experience. When I look at the times that I have encountered God most deeply, it's usually been amidst a very difficult season of life. Something hard is happening. A season of pain, a season of loss, a season of uncertainty. And it's in those times that I've seen God's glory most. He's met me and he's carried me through that stuff. And many of you have seen God demonstrate his glory on the platform of pain. Jesus continues, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. To which they thought, see, now that's what you do, Jesus. We're talking about one thing, and now you're talking about something else. What are you talking about? He goes on, he says, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And Jesus is saying, like right now, you are seeing God do marvelous things in me. Right now, it's daytime, but my time is coming to an end. I'm not going to be physically present with you much longer. Night is coming when I'll be gone. It's coming soon. So pay attention to what you see happening. Pay attention and remember. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. This is one of those deals where I go, I wish we had more details. Like, did he ask him first? Right? Did the guy know how Jesus made the mud? I mean, we're like, oh, but it's Jesus. Guys, it's still spit. Right? And then Jesus asked this man to take a step of faith. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. At this point, okay, and this is what we need to understand, at this point, no healing has happened. Nothing's happened. Jesus has spit in the dirt, made some mud, put it on the guy's face, and the guy's like, ah. And Jesus says, okay, now go wash in the pool of Siloam. And just see what happens. Just see what happens. And you think about that. To do that, this blind man has to leave this place where he's familiar, this place where he goes every day and he begs, where he makes his living. Why in the world would he be willing to do that? It's interesting because Jesus asks this man to walk by faith and not by what? Like literally, right? And do you know what the man did? He did what your heavenly Father and my heavenly Father is inviting you and me to do. He chose to trust someone he could not see based on rumors. What did he know about Jesus? Only what he had heard. Only what he'd heard. It says, so the man went and washed and came home seeing. So pretty soon there's a buzz in the entire community. He goes home, right back home after this, and he can see. And it says his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, nah, it only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man, right? I am the guy formerly known as the blind beggar. And they asked the question that anybody would ask, well, how, right? How then were your eyes opened? They asked. And he replied, he said, the man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. And I'm thinking maybe he didn't know how Jesus made the mud. And maybe it's better not to know. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Now, this next part is hilarious to me. They say, where is this man, they asked him. I don't know, he said. I didn't see where he went. Right? Idiots. So next, they do what was like customary when somebody was miraculously healed. So that someone could come back into society after a disease and they were considered unclean, okay, in the Jewish culture, so that they could be declared clean and fit for the temple and all of that again, you would present them to the religious leaders, okay? So that's what they did. It says, so they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. And here's where, like, if you're watching this as a movie, the music changes. And we go from like happy, celebrative, trumpety sort of stuff to like some dark, like pipe organ stuff. Because Jesus has just done it again. John says, now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Jesus, when are you going to learn? You can't work on the Sabbath. And according to first century rabbinic traditions, healing people counted as work. And we've already seen this being a problem for Jesus, right, throughout this series. So it says, therefore, the Pharisees also asked him, the man who had been healed, how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, talking about Jesus, is not from God. Okay, the man who healed you is not from God. Well, how do you know that? Well, it's obvious, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now, technically, what he wasn't keeping was their version of the Sabbath. But in reality, he didn't violate any part of God's written law, the intention, the heart behind the law. What happened is, and let's, before we get all judgmental on this, what happened is Jesus wasn't fitting into their God box. Right? And whether we recognize it or not, most of us, maybe all of us, maybe even those of us who struggle to believe in God or don't believe in God at all, we have a God box. And Jesus is operating outside the boundaries of their God box. Therefore, he can't possibly be from God. It says, but others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. So there's all this confusion about what to make of the evidence. Same evidence, very different reactions to it. So they decide to try to get more clarity. They need some answers. It says, then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet? He's like, I don't know. He's a prophet, I guess. But that answer is unacceptable to these men because Jesus can't be from God. It can't be that. Whatever it is, it's not that. So they start grasping. It says they still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. So they bring in the man's parents, and his parents are afraid because when you get called in by the Pharisees on a Sabbath, it's probably because you've done something wrong. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? We know he is our son, his parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. They're like trying to get away from the situation. They're like, ask him. He's of age. right? He'll speak for himself. So John explains, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided. They had already made up their minds. And that's the thing. There was just no room for this. There was no room in their worldview for what they were seeing. No room to make sense of what was right in front of them. They had already decided. They had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Okay, that little phrase, put out, the way that we'd say that is that those people would be excommunicated, right? They'd be banned from Jewish worship and community, like forever. And in a way, I guess we could say that the Pharisees were blind. In this story, they're the ones that are blind. They were blinded by their presuppositions about how the world works. Okay, it was willful blindness. There was something to see, but they refused to look. Okay, it's confirmation bias. Just run wild, willful blindness. There's something right there to see, but you refuse to even begin to look. And guys, can we be honest? We are all prone to doing this sometimes. It's human nature. And here's why. Because we are most comfortable with what we already believe. So we prefer information that confirms what we already believe. And we resist anything that might challenge us, anything that might require us to change or tweak what we believe. The Pharisees are refusing to see, so they just kind of keep at this guy. They keep pestering this guy. It says, a second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. And I love the directness and the simplicity of this guy's response. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. He's like, I don't know everything. I don't understand everything. But I don't have to understand everything to believe something. I don't have to be able to explain everything to believe what's right in front of my eyes. And here's the good news for you and for me. Neither do we. Neither do we. But we can get so hung up, right? Especially in matters of religious faith. We want to understand everything before we believe anything. And guys, I am so wired this way. And this is why it took me like years to come to faith. I was convinced that I needed to understand everything before I could begin to believe something. And it got overwhelming. And I found myself in this place of like cognitive dissonance, right? It was like just so uncomfortable because there was way too much there to just not believe it. And yet I had so many questions. It was just extremely unsettling to be living in that place. But here's what I've come to see. Sometimes when it comes to faith, we hold ourselves to an utterly unreasonable standard. Like we give ourselves a lot more grace in other arenas of life. For example, do you believe in love? Can you explain love? If you can, I want to sit down with you after this. I mean, like, do you believe in energy? Can you explain energy? Like, no one can fully explain it. Do you believe in consciousness? Can't really explain that either. You don't have to be able to fully explain something in order to experience it. And so maybe God is saying to you, I'm so much bigger than you could possibly understand. So how about this? Why don't we just start with baby steps? And as you walk with me, you will continually understand more and more and more. The Pharisees want to know from the healed guy, how do you explain this? We need you to give us an explanation that covers everything here. How do you explain this? And he boldly says, I can't. But one thing I know for sure, I was blind, but now I see. Man, that is that like it's so simple and so beautiful. Somebody should turn that into a song lyric. You think? And here's why I think that statement, that phrase, I guess it's a sentence. I'll work on my English later. Here's why I think that resonates so deeply. It's because this is the story of millions and millions and millions of people. In fact, for many of you that are sitting here this morning, this is your story, right? Like something happened in your life that's undeniable. And it's like I can't explain it all. I don't understand it all. All I know is this. There was a season in my life where I was at the end of myself. There was a season in my life when I had hit a wall. There was a season in my life where I was controlled by an addiction. There was a season in my life that I was so lonely that I was suicidal. There was a season in my life where I had come to the end. It was like I had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to turn. And I cried out to God, or I asked God, or I got on my knees, or I said, God, if you're real, or I said, God, if you're there, and I can't explain it. All I can tell you is something happened. And for some of you, it happened instantly. For some of you, it happened very gradually. But something happened. And you could summarize your story by saying you were blind, but now you see. Because you've never been the same. And when you share your story, you acknowledge, right? There's all kinds of stuff you can't explain. But one thing you know, I'm just telling you, okay? You're saying to somebody, I'm just telling you, one thing I know, I would not go back to where I was before for anything. It's only by the grace of a living, personal God who has invited me to call him Father that I am where I am in my life today. All I know is this: I was blind, but now I see. But the Pharisees, they keep pressing on this guy. They keep pressing and pressing on this guy, just peppering him. Then they asked him, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And what they're really looking for here is some reasons not to believe, something to discredit this whole story. And now this guy's just like done. He's fed up. He answered, I have told you already and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And then he takes a jab and he says, do you want to become his disciples too? Right? Like he's had it. He's done being polite. It says, then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. Okay, he's like, my being healed is pretty remarkable, but you know what's even more remarkable? You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. Isn't it obvious where he comes from? Isn't it right in front of your eyes? How much more evidence do you need? He continues, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now, they're not used to beggars talking like this to them. So to this, they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Willful blindness, confirmation bias, refusing to see what's right in front of you, being too afraid to see something that might go against your worldview. Can we just be honest? Like, that's not a good look on anyone. It's not a good look on anyone. And Christians, we are certainly not immune, are we? I mean, come on. Historically, our resistance to science, like our resistance to people who aren't like us, I mean, doesn't our resistance to see outside of our God box make us look a little bit like the religious leaders from this story? And what has often happened with like God-in-the-box Christians is that instead of eagerly expressing compassion, people who are different just get this from us. They just get this. When they look to the church community, to the Christians, to the ones who are supposed to be the most loving people on earth, they get this. And this is what happens again and again and again with Christians who are met with people that fall outside of the God box that they've created. If we've limited God to the God of the box, then we run the risk of withholding compassion to people that he loves. But you know what else? We run the risk of missing out on the activity of God. Willful blindness has caused so many problems for the church. I mean, can we show love and grace to people that are different from us? Can we explore science without being afraid of it? See, if we reduce God to a much smaller version and then require people to believe in our smaller version, how much spiritual damage does that inflict on the people around us? In Jesus' day, the religious leaders created all kinds of artificial barriers. And people hungry for God were told that they could not know him. They were told that they couldn't pursue him. They were told that they would not be loved by him. And Jesus came, and part of what Jesus did is he just blew all of that out of the water. And yet again and again, religious people go back to that, and we do it over. We do it again, and we do it again. Guys, we had better be really, really careful. Because if people are moving toward God, if they're legitimately hungry for God, if they take a step toward him, then we should be the most eager people on planet Earth to celebrate that. Even if they aren't getting it all right. Right? Even if their theology is wrong on some stuff, it's incomplete. Even if they pray with faulty ideas about God in their mind. Even if their lives are still really, really messy. If they're moving toward God, God is asking us to come alongside them. After all, just a little confession, my theology's incomplete. And I pray with imperfect ideas about God all the time. And you know what else? As much as it's been transformed, my life is still a mess. We are all works in progress. We're all still growing. So who are any of us to put a hand in people's face that are legitimately seeking after God? Tell you what, I don't want to get that wrong. I don't want to get that wrong. If we aren't able to move beyond the God of the box, we run the risk of just missing out on the activity of God. Now, if you're not a Christian and you've been sitting back going, you let them have it, Pastor. I got something for you. Are you sure that none of this is real? Have you looked? Have you really looked? Are you afraid to look? Are you curious? Have you closed the door on the concept of God? Have you closed the door on Jesus possibly being who he claimed to be? And here's a question for you. It's possible that you have a God box too. And anything that doesn't immediately fit, you immediately dismiss. Might there be a little bit of confirmation bias for you? Might there be a little bit of willful blindness for you? Here's something crazy to think about. Maybe the God you're dismissing is the tiny little God that some God-of-the-box Christians have created. What if he's so much bigger? What if there's so much more? And yet, what if you have given up looking? How in the world could multitudes of people see Jesus? How could they see the miracles, see the signs, and not believe? How in the world did they miss what God was doing right before their eyes? I think it's pretty simple. It didn't fit inside their box. And so this morning, I just want us to think about our lives right here, right now, in this time. Many of us, we say we want to see God. We want to experience his activity. And so what in the world would cause us to miss out on that? I guess my question is, what if God works in ways that are outside your box? Because see, if you aren't willing to expand your box, you might just be missing out on the activity of God.